Alfred Thayer Mahan, born in 1840 and died in 1914, is considered one of the most influential and important American authors and strategists of the 19th century. He was a historian and a United States naval officer. He graduated in 1859 from the Naval Academy and later served the Union during the American Civil War and was promoted commander of the USS Wachusett. He became notorious after writing The Influence of Sea Power upon History in 1890, inspired by Jomini's military theories, and The Influence of Sea Power upon the French Revolution and Empire in 1892. Later on, in 1912, he wrote Armaments and Arbitration, or The Place of Force in International Relations of States, a collection of 10 articles written between 1911 and 1912. The article that we'll be analyzing is from this book, and in order to fully understand it, we have to understand the context. So we have to know that Mahan wrote this article in the beginning of the 20th century in the context of imperialist expansion in which Western nations competed for global hegemony. Sorry. Just like Mackinder, Mahan is one of the founding fathers of Anglo-Saxon geopolitics. But although these two authors are pioneers in the matter of geopolitics, they have two different visions. Differently than Mackinder, Mahan did not consider that imperialism was over in the beginnings of the 20th century. So that means that for Mahan, the states would continue to compete and fight to expand their territories led by their own interests. For Mahan, the main logic in geopolitics was an expansionist one seeking hegemony. Mahan stresses the importance to build a sea power to ensure a world supremacy, and here we can see that his theory is influenced by the history of the British Empire and its sea power. One of the main characteristics of Mahan's geopolitical thoughts is that strategy must take into account civilization. We could say that geopolitics is not only about the conquest of land but also of minds. The ideological aspect is just as important. The beginning of the 20th century is also a context of nationalist movements in the Middle East, and that means a thread represented by the Middle Eastern civilizations to the West, to the Western Christian civilization.
This text is an extract from Mahan's work, The Place of Force in International Relations, 1912. Mahan illustrates two important concepts. The first one is the necessity of the use of force by the West to guide the Eastern civilization for the common interest and benefit of the world, and the second one is the clash of civilizations. From one hand, the modern Western civilization versus the Middle Eastern civilization that were stuck in the Middle Ages for Mahan. For this presentation, we chose to analyze the text integrally and chronologically and explain it using the research we did in order to offer an in-depth analysis and comprehension of the two main ideas mentioned above.
So, in this quote, we have the idea that nations are rivaling outside the European scene. The rivalry is not only between them, but between the citizens and the intruders, that is to say, the Ottoman Empire. Mahan's geopolitical theory has been very largely anchored in the context of imperial rivalry between the great European powers eager to preserve. In the case of Great Britain, the population subjected to the yoke of the imperialist nations was a problem primarily strategic and Western. Mahan, that was considered the evangelist for sea power, saw the world as a battlefield where the developed nations of the West had to wage a merciless war for the control of maritime communication and ensuring their outlets necessary for the supply of their national economy. As such, to a first bipolarization of the world between civilized nations and barbarian nations was grafted a second bipolarization, this time between maritime powers and continental powers in the West, such as France and Russia. We also have the Mahan's idea of overseas imperialism, and that idea is fundamentally opposed to the model of the continental power, which had to incorporate into the culture of the conquering nation that of the conquered nations. However, there was a threat to the sustainability of the British Empire because Germany's aim was to become a world power and no longer just a great European power. Therefore, they were working on combining land and sea power. In addition, the concessions granted by the Turkey to German industrialists for the construction of the railway line supposed to connect Berlin to Baghdad posed a great threat to the strategic security of British communication routes with India and to the influence of Britain around the Suez Canal and the Turkish Straits.
By this sentence, Mahan refers to Islam professed by the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. Mahan understood that there was a new factor to be added to the competition, which is civilization. As a result to the factors mentioned before, Mahan started to study a new model of imperialism, which is the civilizational imperialism for the Middle East. The goal here was to preserve the Middle East crossroads of communication routes between Europe, Asia, and Africa at all costs from the influence of rival nations. By rival nations, Mahan means the Europeans and especially the Ottomans, but also from the hostility of local populations and anti Western nationalism. And to do so, Mahan thought that the local populations had to be taken into account. Mahan was the first to talk about the concept of the clash of civilizations. Mahan emphasized on moral and cultural expansion. That was for him the ambition behind every war. The competition for the imperialist European nations was justified by the concept of national self preservation. However, for Mahan, Great Britain could not be satisfied with the simple preservation of national interests. It was their duty to guide and modernize those civilizations. The evangelists of naval power had to succeed the evangelists of Christianity. Sorry, and that's what brings us to the religious comparison Mahan establishes between Islam and Christianity.
Here, Mahan compares Christianity and Islam, saying that what differs these two religions is the fact that in Christianity, man's will to cooperate determine the purpose of the Creator. Mahan also talks about Christian qualities that create social reflexes and tendencies, saying that the Christians' cooperative impulse is due to self-abnegation, which is a Christian quality. The capacity for organization differs from civilization to civilization. The Christian type of organizational capacity comes from the Christian conception that without man's will to cooperate, the Creator's goal can take place. The author also justifies the use of force in Christian civilization if it is in order to achieve the Creator's will, which is the Commonwealth. Mahan also advocates a certain form of geopolitical utilitarianism, which wanted that the territories with high strategic value of the Middle East, then under the authority of the Ottoman administration, would be better developed by Westerners. The civilizational side of Mahan's geopolitical theories, in fact, stems largely from the weakness of the Turkish government and the chronic financial problems plaguing the Sultan's empire. According to him, the weakness of Turkey had geostrategic repercussions as much as political. Geostrategic because Russia as well as Germany eager to find maritime outlets in the Mediterranean to increase their influence on the crossroads of communication routes, and political because of the Ottoman population risked rebelling against the Turkish administration, which ignored local identities. Mahan considered the Middle East and Asian civilizations as inferior because they were late in time, stuck in the past as if they were asleep, and it was ideal for him to prevent the awakening of the civilizations to be like the one from a Christian civilization based on conquest of other territories. And to avoid that, it is to protect Christian civilization from a threat that was the awakening of the Oriental civilizations in the context of nationalist movements started in the beginnings of the 20th century in the Middle East. It was about preventing a civilizational shock that would rattle the Christian civilization by political and military conquests. So, the West, faced with cultural threats of seeing its political, ideological, and religious system invaded by new ideas coming from the East, had to unite for the preservation of its values. So, to the evangelist of maritime power had to succeed the evangelist of Christianity. Mahan saw the world divided along political lines. In one side, we had the democracies of the West, and in the other, the autocracies of the East. But he also added a religious dimension, separating Catholic and Protestant nations from Orthodox and Muslim nations. For him, Western states had to continually develop spirituality, that is to say, to convert the whole of the Western world to the idea that the democratic system of maritime expansion would always advantage over continental imperialism. Then, in a second step, to convert the whole of Asia to the spiritual system of European nations. It wasn't only a material expansion, but a moral expansion. For Mahan, the economy should thus be used as means of domination. Force in the Middle East, faced with nationalist threats, would only accentuate a feeling of rejection of Western ideas. Thus, force to Mahan could be used in the settlement of conflicts between Western nations, but the recourse to military solutions should be delayed as much as possible in the regions where armed conflict was likely to be combined with a cultural conflict. On the other hand, showing the Ottoman populations the benefits of the capitalist economy would show them how ineffective their administration was and could overturn an internal system of thought. However, the imperialism preached by Mahan could produce the rejection of the very idea of universal civilization wanted and promoted by the West, and which shows on the part of the Westerners a total lack of understanding of the other.
So the first quote I seen on the presentation, Mahan says that Christians can use their power when necessary. He talks about geopolitical utilitarianism. Um, it is the duty of Christians and Occidentals to save and guide the Middle East. Therefore, if power is needed, then it can be used and it must be used for the benefit of the world civilization. The second quote, Mahan explains that the threat of a clash of civilizations came firstly from the fact that the Middle East, for Mahan, lived stuck in the past. The East as a whole, from Turkey to China, belonged to a different time from that in which the West lived. The line of separation between the East and the West was not spatial, but it was cultural and temporal. It was the duty of Europeans to pull the Orient from its secular age to guide the East on the path of civilization and to evolve rather than to transform the whole of the Ottoman populations in the first time. For Mahan the Christian, the peoples of Asia were like sheep without a shepherd, and their civilizations had not been able to evolve and therefore could not regenerate alone without the help or pressure of the Christian nations of the West. The European model of civilization had to be exported, failing which the Middle East would remain indefinitely anchored in an inability to modernize. Consequently, the geopolitical organization of the world was moving towards a political and cultural bipolarization, which was dangerous for the stability of the Western ideological system as a whole. And that is why aggression and force is important, and that's what legitimizes it for Mahan. In the last quote, Mahan conveyed the idea of a word civilization, whose values carried by the Western Christian nations would be in opposition to those of the civilizations of the East. For Mahan, a civilization is a standard against which other societies could be judged, and that is what justifies the use of force by Christianity as a political system in front of the resistance of the East.